It's time for the Waiver Wire, presented by YouTube TV. List of waiver wire targets put together by our own Matt Okada. Starting at quarterback, Jake Browning, who has been red hot going against the Steelers. Then you got Joe Flacco. He of the 374 passing yards this past week, taking on the Houston Texans. Baker Mayfield, who we've spoken about a lot on this show today. He's got the Jaguars. Gardner Minshew heading down to Atlanta to take on the Falcons. And Jacoby Brissett, likely going to be Sam Howell starting, but just in case, Brissett could be a nice pickup going against the Jetropolitans. Meanwhile, some running back targets. Ty Chandler, who looked very good this weekend, going against the Lions. Zamir White, at least as an insurance play, if Josh Jacobs can come back. They're facing the Chiefs. Tyjae Spears going against the bad Seahawks run defense. Rico Dowdle on to Miami as a nice handcuff to Tony Pollard. Chase Brown getting a lot more opportunities for the Bengals going against the Steelers. Trey Sermon, a nice add, especially if Zach Moss can't go this week against the Falcons. Rashawn Johnson and what's become a three-headed backfield in Chicago. Then a pair of commanders with Antonio Gibson and Chris Rodriguez. Finally, we got some pass catchers for you. Josh Palmer had the one big play against the Raiders. That's all it took to have a good fantasy day. He's got the Bills this week. Noah Brown, who's been playing some good football, he's taking on the Cleveland Browns. Curtis Samuel had a touchdown on Sunday for the Commanders. He's got the Jets this week. Demarcus Robinson has been a touchdown machine lately, taking on the Saints. That is a Thursday night game. And then a couple of tight ends. Hunter Henry against the Broncos and Isaiah Likely against the 49ers. So joining us now, as always about this time, it's Matt Okada. You can check him out on Twitter at Matt Okada. You can also check out his waiver wire column at NFL.com/waiver wire. So here we are. It is week 2. I woke up this morning, Matt, thinking to myself, like, I'm old enough to remember when this would have been championship week, but we still got one more week to go because week 18 is still on the horizon. But let's talk some quarterbacks because we talk about revenge games a lot, and maybe we don't always use the term correctly, but Jake Browning against the Vikings was legitimately a revenge game. I mean, afterwards, he was like, you shouldn't have bleeping cut me. Dude's been on fire at this point. He seems like a really good streaming option for people.
Yeah, he was letting them know after that win. Listen, we can all pretend that Jake Browning isn't playing better football than Joe Burrow was in an injury-marred season, but we'd be pretending because he's playing better football than almost everybody in the NFL. As a starter, he is averaging 295 yards per game with a 76% completion rate, 9.1 yards per attempt, and a 109 passer rating. Those numbers would rank first, second, and second, each of those behind only Brock Purdy, among all qualified quarterbacks on the season. And even with just 12 fantasy points in his debut start, Browning has averaged 20.3 per game as the starter over this past month. Listen, the other shoe could eventually drop, but I see no evidence that it will. He has great pass catchers. He's got a great offense. And I think we have to consider him a legitimate starter until something changes, which I don't necessarily see happening. By the way, the Steelers defense he gets next week, they just allowed 20.9 fantasy points to Bailey Zappi and 20.6 to Gardner Minshew. So it feels like Browning is more or less guaranteed for a 20 burger this Saturday.
Speaking of 20 burgers on Saturdays, Ty Chandler, and he's not available in a lot of my leagues because he was in my starting lineup last week, but Okada, should people be rushing to pick him up, and do you think he could take the job away from Alexander Mattison?
Yeah, it's an interesting one with Ty Chandler, only rostered in 28% of NFL.com leagues, and that's because we didn't really know what to expect in his starting debut with Alexander Mattison out after the team tried their darndest to avoid that reality all season. I have no idea why they did, because he took 26 touches for 157 yards, a goal line touchdown, and 25 fantasy points. He was efficient and explosive, which are two words rarely used of Alexander Mattison this season, and it was all against what has been a solid defensive front. Next week, they get the Lions, who are even tougher against running backs, and we don't know whether Mattison returns. But to your point, I think Chandler is a must-add anyway, and I think there is a non-zero chance that if Kevin O'Connell and company are watching the same tape I am, Chandler just keeps the starting job moving forward because he has looked better than Mattison frequently. I think he will be in line for 20-plus touches if Mattison does sit, which makes him a locked and loaded start. If Madison's back, it becomes a little bit more of a fringe flex play. Watch the news from beat reporters.
The Vikings have been telling us that they don't want Alexander Madison to be the guy. I mean, that's why they added Cam Akers. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. Ty Chandler gives them another excuse to sort of move Madison out of that role.
It's been fun if you have Chase Brown, I guess. Not so much if you have Joe Mixon because he's stealing work and looking really good doing so. But how do you feel about the Bengals running back?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings. Chase Brown is simultaneously one of the most exciting and most frustrating options in fantasy right now, very much a la Keaton Mitchell, hope he gets better, and Devon Achane this year, in that he has consistently shown he could have an elite RB1 ceiling with a full workload because of how electric he is, but he's instead playing change of pace to a, quote, reliable early down, quote, plotter. I use those two terms loosely because Joe Mixon, Gus Edwards, and Raheem Mostert have all been quite solid in their own. But the tough part with Brown is that I don't necessarily expect his role to change that much from what we've seen these past couple weeks, which have been growing, so that's nice. But the Bengals have had great success with this split. This past Saturday, he had 10 touches to Mixon's 13 in that overtime win. He's averaging 6.6 yards per touch, which makes it a lot easier to deal with that low volume count.